In other words, I think a resource, the learner's resource, needs to be tapped first. And like other resources, sometimes it's not that easy to find. It can be buried quite deep. Let me give you two personal examples. Since this is a BESIG conference, I'll tell about some examples I taught teaching business. The first one was with in an insurance company in Barcelona. It was with a group of students. There were around 6 or 7 from many different departments of the insurance company. The needs analysis that I did with them didn't give me that much. In fact, the main thing they had in common of what they wanted for their English lessons was it was like an extra coffee break, sort of a long coffee break. They didn't seem to need English immediately for their jobs, but the company had paid for them to have English lessons, and so they were going. We didn't get a lot of chatting, in fact. They would kind of drift in at different times, and they kind of waited around expectantly when I arrived to give the class. They waited around. Sometimes I wondered if they were waiting around for the Lindsay show to turn up and entertain them before they had to go back to work. So here the resources were quite hard to tap. They didn't really want to talk. They didn't have sort of urgent pressing needs. We still got through English classes, but it was challenging. The second second anecdote I'd like to tell you was that I was teaching a one-to-one business class as well. This in another company. It was an executive in a one-to-one class. Now he knew exactly why he needed English. He wanted to chat. He wanted to practice his English. He had an intermediate level. He wanted to practice. He had led a very interesting life. He had traveled to many different countries. He was very wealthy, and he liked to let me know it. Basically, he was overflowing with resources. His resources were just bubbling up and coming all over the place. When it came to actually sort of trying to do some language work or sort of focus on how we can improve things, he wasn't always so keen. Basically, he just wanted to chat and talk about things and nothing else. Basically, talk about himself. And perhaps here, I was quite young at this time, so I was very nervous to challenge him on anything. And he managed to take over the class a lot more. Then at the end, he told me his English hadn't improved as much as he had hoped. So there we had two different experiences. One where I couldn't get the resource, I couldn't tap into the resource. The other was like the oil well that had exploded and I was just making a mess of it all. I think if one wants to use the learner as a resource, and of course I think we all do, and we're going to have some excellent examples of people who have done this on our panel, I think it has to be managed carefully. I don't think you can just go into a class, perhaps like I had imagined when I had my first classes in these businesses, and just expect everything to come from them. There are a few things that you need to be aware of before you get to that point, I believe. And I think one of these important things, and I want to leave you with this before I pass on to the others, one of these important things is your role as a leader in the group. Many of us teaching business English, it was the case for me, there's often been sort of a bit of a worry about your level of expertise, especially if you're teaching executives who view you as sort of another service, like the other kind of services they hire, or in large groups teaching working in kind of industries that you know nothing about. There's a bit of a worry about our own expertise. The stock answer being that our expertise that we bring to the classroom is a language one. And that we needn't be experts in everything. The students are experts. Since they're the experts, they will bring that resource. So who's the leader in this case? Now, in many groups, I think there's a moment at the beginning of any class thing where the teacher is imagined that the teacher will be the leader. Now, this can change very quickly, but the teacher is viewed perhaps in that very first class, perhaps for the first 5 minutes, the first month, depending on how you use it, you're viewed as the leader. And here I want to just come to a book that that really affected the way I thought about language teaching and classroom dynamics. It's called Group Dynamics in the Language Classroom. It's not my book. I'm not an editor of this book or anything to do with it. It's just a great book I read about understanding groups. And one of the things they talked about was leadership skills and different theories of leadership. I want to mention one that a theory of leadership styles by Kurt Lewin, a landmark study. You'd have to get this book to sort of read more in detail, but they talked about 3 different kinds of leadership styles and the effect it had on students. One was the autocratic or authoritarian leadership, gets right in your face, controls everything, and complete control over the group at all times. The other was the democratic leadership, where the leader shares some of the leadership functions with members. And then the other was a laissez-faire leadership, where the teacher performs very leadership roles or behavior at all. Now, this was there have been several studies that looked at these different kinds of leadership and their effect on classes. And it was suggested that under autocratic leaderships, the minute the teacher wasn't around or turned their back, things would kind of go apart. It was very hard for the teacher to keep that leadership role all the time. Students didn't always like this in the long run. Democratic leadership tended to be better viewed, and if the teacher left the room on a democratic leadership situation, students would continue work even without the teacher being there. The laissez-faire leadership was interesting to note that students didn't like that much either, especially not at the beginning. There was confusion about what they were to do, what the role was, and so on. The groups that tended to have the friendliest group feeling were the democratic leadership groups. What the authors of this book suggested is to reach that idea of democratic leadership at the beginning of a class, at the beginning of a course. It's important to still take the leadership role, almost to be a little bit autocratic at the beginning, before beginning to hand over to students. This is a general rule of thumb. I'm sure all of you have had experiences where you could say, well, not in that particular class, but as a general rule of thumb, I find when I'm teaching with a new group, I take control a lot at the beginning of the class. I bring in, for example, stimulus to get the class communicating. That could be a book, it could be an article, it could be something. I decide the rhythm of what's going to happen and when. Slowly, as the group begins to form and we get communication going between each other and more of a trust established, that's when I feel safer and the group feels safer, getting more resourceful on their own. So beginning to give over some of those aspects of leadership. So to finish off with, the things that I'd like to do, again, I just want to repeat some things that I'd like to do in class, and then we'll see what the other people in the panel say. Bringing in stimulus to get students communicating. If we want to use the resources inside, I still think they have to be tapped. They have to be brought out, and that is best done through a stimulus. Each class that I go to, try to find a little bit more out about the students and start accumulating a bank of information of things that I know about them that will help bring in future stimuli, and eventually that they will be able to start using to lead the classes themselves. Slowly letting them take charge of their learning and decisions on what things they bring into class. And in the end, my idea is that I would move more from a leader to a facilitator, sharing more information. Finally, I'd like to say that it's always important to keep pace and interest going by even when you've passed on, the learner is sort of the resource and you and the learners are tapping into this and using this for language learning. I still think to keep variety and pace and classes interesting, keep surprise element there, to bring in bits of material and other stimuli from time to time to change things up. That's bringing to the end of my 15-minute intervention. The last word I didn't mention at the beginning that collocates with resource, strong resource word that collocates, a noun, is resource management. I hope to have shown you in my 15 minutes here some brief ideas that I had about resource management, of how it's worked and not worked. But I think we're going to be able to get much more into this with the other people that are going to be speaking on the panel. I've already read their little abstracts, and I'm familiar with some of their work already. It sounds excellent, very interesting stuff. I'm sure there'll be ideas here, lots of things to learn from. And thank you very much.